I thought, in terms of business, let me go at it from three different areas. To the degree that the United States is still a relatively major locomotive in pulling the economy forward, my guess is, and I'm going to talk primarily about a Trump presidency, my guess is that Trump would actually represent a dramatic acceleration of American economic growth. And that a great deal of his entire program, from infrastructure development to tax policy to regulatory policy to energy policy, would all be driving at the idea of getting a Reagan-style 5, 6, 7% a year growth. And to the degree that in America growing at that rate is by definition useful to the world economy, it'll be powerful. The second area you have to think about is trade. And I want to dispel one of the dumber things that people sometimes write about in the media. You know, as you may have noticed, the day after the Brexit vote, Donald Trump was at Turnberry in Scotland because he owns it. He could also have been in Panama City, Panama, because he has a Trump Towers. He could have been in Dubai because he has a Trump Towers. Eric, actually his son, who's going to speak tonight, spends a great deal of his time developing international business for the company. I mean, so the idea that he's in any way an isolationist is crazy. This is a guy who has a very thorough understanding that the world market matters. He has a pretty good understanding of tourism. And I think that he has a pretty good understanding of job creation. But he believes that American trade negotiators have been amazingly incompetent. And I can tell, look, I am in favor of the largest possible trading system in the world. I was the whip for the Republican side on passing NAFTA. I actually got more votes in the House than Gore and Clinton did. And I'm very willing to defend the international order. But I will also tell you, it's currently, partly because of what happened to us coming out of World War II. Because we were the only country that wasn't bombed among the industrial countries, we came out of World War II as about 50% of the world GDP in 1946. And that was obviously unsustainable, and we knew it was unsustainable. And that's why you get the Marshall Plan. You get a variety of other things. But in the process, we acquired a set of habits that are now not sustainable. And so I think you've got to really look at various patterns. You've got to look at the degree to which the European Union very intelligently uses regulatory policy to minimize American capabilities. I've been involved in one a tiny issue involving bananas for over 20 years, where the American banana company has a real problem because of discrimination. You watch the European Union's attitude towards Google and towards Facebook and towards large American companies, you know, but that. Fine, then maybe we'll figure out what Europe's really good at, and we should do the same thing. But one, I'm very happy to talk about real trade negotiations, but I'm not particularly willing to be lectured about free trade. Second, you look at China. The Director of National Intelligence staff reported 6 weeks ago that China last year stole $360 billion in intellectual property. That's twice the size of our total sales to China. Now, why would you want to follow a trade regime in which your largest economic competitor on the planet gets away with that kind of behavior, and you're supposed to pretend that it's really okay? Now, how Trump will work this out, I have no idea. I tell everybody, you will not know what he's doing every morning because he will not know what he's doing every morning. This is not because he's stupid. It's because he's a very dynamic businessman who believes in responding in virtually real time to changing developments. And he is a ruthless negotiator. I recommend to all of you that you get 2 books if you want to understand him and report back to your home government. One is The Art of the Deal, which is was a New York Times bestseller for a year in the 1980s, is a remarkably good, solid business book. And the other is The Art of the Comeback, which is a fascinating study of how he recovered from being virtually destroyed in the early 1990s, and the steps he took and how he took them and the lessons he learned. When you read those 2 books, you realize this is a very sophisticated person. And this is a guy who went from real estate in Manhattan to golf courses worldwide, to casinos, to hotels, to at one time the largest selling tie in the United States, to the #1 TV show, The Apprentice, for 13 years. You know, and just package all this stuff together and say, so you think this guy's dumb? No, he's different. I mean, part of what marks him off is he's different. He really shakes a lot of Republicans, because a lot of people became Republican to live in an orderly world. You know, they like being in a board of directors suite. They like being in a traditional country club. This guy is literally a blue-collar billionaire. He spent a lot of his time working, building buildings, talking to the guy down and the woman down on the street who was building it. Actually hired the first woman to build a high-rise in New York, put her in charge of the company. And so he talks at a fourth grade level. Why does he talk at a fourth grade level, since he's a Wharton graduate? He does it because he learned over the years, if you speak at about a fourth grade level, everybody understands you. And it requires you to use a common language which you can't, you know, if you're sophisticated enough, you can use a lot of big words that have no meaning but sound really good, so by the time you're done, the person won't know what you said. You can't do that at a fourth grade level. And so Trump really specializes in that. The other point I'd make is that he is the most sophisticated user of social media in American politics. And this is something people just don't understand. You know, Jeb Bush, who was a very fine governor, would have been a very good candidate in a normal year, raised about $110 or $120 million. And they spent a ton of it attacking Trump. Didn't matter. Trump spent virtually nothing on advertising, because he wakes up in the morning, he does a couple of tweets before he gets out of bed. He has 7 or 8 million followers on Twitter, including every reporter. So his tweets get magnified in the news media instantaneously. Then he goes downstairs. He doesn't drink coffee, so I presume he gets orange juice or something. And he calls into Fox and Friends. Does 9 or 10 minutes. Then he calls into Morning Joe. Does 9 or 10 minutes. Then he has breakfast and thinks about what would be a good thing to do around 10 or 11 to make news. So he makes news about 10 or 11. Then he thinks, am I going to do an hour with Greta tonight, or an hour with Sean, or a long session with somebody else? And so he goes and he gets an hour of free TV time. Now, in the course of the day, he's just generated something on, and he also, by the way, does a daily feed on his Facebook page, which reaches about 8 million people for free. And so this machine, which is just him, I mean, it's not a complicated machine, it's him, dominates political media in the United States. As president, I suspect he will be president a lot like he's a candidate. He'll be constant energy, a slightly obscure American reference for some of you. The best way to think of Trump is he's 1/3 Andrew Jackson, who was the most disruptive figure in American presidential history, 1/3 Theodore Roosevelt, who had endless energy, and 1/3 P.T. Barnum, who sold every single day. And Trump actually kind of likes that analogy. He's open. He's a salesman. He wants to know what are prices. So, for example, he's going to be for a huge infrastructure program. And that's good to him because he can go sell it. He understands how to sell a big infrastructure program. So on trade, what you're going to have is a guy who's very aggressive about negotiations, very aggressive about American exports, but very sophisticated. He has no interest in breaking up the world market. He just has a real interest in balancing the patterns under which it currently operates. The last area where I think he will be really important and really different is terrorism. And as you can tell from the last couple of weeks, that's really important. Terrorism is beginning to be ubiquitous enough that it is a drag on the world economy. I mean, you know, just ask the number of people who are a little worried about going through Istanbul right now. Turkish Air is arguably one of the best airlines in Europe. But I'll bet you they're suffering dramatic decline in people willing to change planes in Turkey, just because it feels wrong. And so I think there's a real challenge here to have a dramatically more aggressive and stronger position on terrorism. And I think in the long run that will actually have a significantly positive effect on trade, because you have to have safety to have free enterprise, and you have to have safety to have tourism. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And countries that have suffered from it can give you very clear indications of how rapidly tourism, for example, dries up if people think they might get killed. The other thing I suspect he will do is dramatically rebuild American military capability. We have clearly lived off of the Reagan buildup. We are clearly underfunded today. Our Navy is shrinking to a point where it can't possibly meet all of its missions. Our aircraft are increasingly old. We are not as aggressive, we're not as dominant in space as we should be. And I think you'll see a very, partly because it's also a great jobs program, I think you'll see a Reagan-style buildup of very substantial size. So that's a sweeping overview, and I think if it's okay, I'm just going to toss it open for questions. Am I allowed to do that?
Mr. Speaker, Joe Hockey, Australian Ambassador. You mentioned China. I don't know if our friend, the Chinese ambassador, is here, but the TPP does not include China.
Right.
It sets intellectual property standards that are based on American standards. Yet Mr. Trump is rejecting the TPP, driving Asia, including Australia, to negotiate an alternate trade agreement called RCEP, which is based more on Chinese standards. Wouldn't it be in America's best interest to have American standards in Asia rather than Chinese standards?
Might be. How thick is TPP?
Very thick.
Very thick. Why would any American presidential candidate stand up and say, I endorse, what is it, 1,500 pages, 1,800 pages? Not counting the codicils and the regulations. I endorse this document I had nothing to do with, and I'm thrilled that the State Department and the President, who I disagree with deeply, are presenting me with this great gift. He's not going to say that. He's going to say, I want to review it carefully. I may reopen it. And if that means you guys want to wander off, fine. If Australia thinks it is more in Australia's future to get closer to China and further from the U.S., that's a perfectly legitimate Australian decision. But I don't think we should operate out of fear. I think we have every right to say we want to review it. And maybe he comes back and says, you know, I'm into bilaterals, but I'm not into multi-state agreements. And I happen to know in at least one section of that, we got a bad intellectual property deal because every small country said to us, oh, we couldn't do that. There'd be rioting in the streets. We'd be caving to the Americans. Well, I don't know that I particularly am worried about the Vietnamese being unhappy about things we want. I mean, we have very real intellectual property interests that we don't necessarily have to give away for some, you know, I get this, Howard Dean and I do a lot of stuff together, and Dean gives me the standard line on the left, which is, this is really important as a geopolitical document. Well, that's 1946 thinking. Why don't I give away another chunk of the American economy for some indirect, vague geopolitical achievement that's frankly not our primary interest right now? We rebuild the American economy, we rebuild the American military, and we have a clearer sense of what we're doing, we'll be just fine in the world. And most countries, I suspect including Australia, will decide they'd rather be close to us than to the Chinese, certainly by the third year of dealing with the Chinese. I don't think very many countries are going to get favorable deals with China.
Good to see you again. Ambassador from Colombia. Just want to see what do you think about Western Hemisphere, you know, trade, security, and all your views on the region?
Well, I can't speak for Trump on this topic because we've not discussed it. I can tell you my personal view is, having a daughter who lives in Key Biscayne and having spent a fair amount of time at the Southern Command, we dramatically need to rethink and reemphasize. I mean, if we'd spent 10% of the time and energy we've spent on Afghanistan in Latin America, we would be better off and Latin America would be better off. Venezuela, as you well know, is a total disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe, and great proof that politicians can destroy a country no matter how wealthy it is. Brazil is very unstable in significant ways, both because of the bribery scandal involving their oil company and the president being impeached. There are concerns, I think, across the region. Our inability, for whatever reason, to help countries like Honduras have adequate strength domestically to police the drug cartels is a tragedy. I think the most dangerous city in the world is a city in Honduras. And it's just tragic. And we have to recognize how much it's a part of our own problems, partly because we buy the drugs, but also because we have not been helping our neighbors be effective. So I would hope, I can't speak for Trump, so please don't write home and say that, but I would hope that we would take a dramatically more methodical and serious investment of people and resources in Latin America, and I think it's very important to us. And this goes all the way back to a book Milton Eisenhower wrote about 1961 called "The Wine is Bitter," in which he was already complaining in '61 that the U.S. continually neglects Latin America, and we've been very lucky not to have had more problems than we've had. because we overinvest in regions that are 8,000 miles away and underinvest in places that are a 2-hour airplane flight.
My question is about, in many, many years, I don't think you've had a businessman millionaire as the president. If Mr. Trump is appointed as the president, he has business in all of these international countries, and I know you have very strict laws to protect your president. Will he have to resign from all the boards that he's in, and how would you address that?
Well, you know, Trump is going to represent a really interesting test because, I mean, what he's going to do is dump it all on the kids. I mean, you can't create a blind trust of the Trump empire because it's so big and so far-flung and it's so complicated. So what he's going to do is say to Don Jr. and Eric and Ivanka and potentially to Tiffany, you guys run that, I'm going to try to run the world. Don't come and bother me unless you get in real trouble. Which doesn't mean he won't have some awareness of you know, his economic interest. On the other hand, and this is very dubious, okay, I'm just, you know, we went, in the last 40 years, we became so absurd in our ethics requirements that, for example, Don Rumsfeld paid at least $70 million in order to be Secretary of Defense. Because in order to meet a series of rules, his partners in a series of partnerships knew he had to sell. And none of them were generous. And it literally cost him about $70 million to serve the country. Well, that's fairly stupid. I mean, it's one thing to say we don't want you to rip off the country. It's another thing to say we're going to rip you off in order for you to serve the country. The other point I make about Trump is, and I don't know what his real worth is. I don't think he knows what his real worth is, but it's significant. I suspect he doesn't care. I mean, I suspect he's now wealthy enough, has enough assets in enough places, that he knows he's taken care of for life. His wife and his kids and his grandkids are taken care of for life. And as long as, and the three older children seem to be very competent. I mean, Eric, for example, did Turnberry and did a under budget, had a schedule. You know, so I think he's going to say, try not to screw it up. I'm giving you a pretty good starting point here, worth a couple $1 billion plus or minus, and I'm going to go be President of the United States. And I think that's probably how he'll handle it. But it'd be impossible for him to put it in a blind trust in any serious, meaningful way, which means the New York Times will have a field day every couple of weeks.
Hello, I am the ambassador of Albania. Actually, I've been working with businesses for over 20 years, and I became ambassador last year. So my question is, knowing, especially now, the completely different mindset of working as a business person and running the money of the government, because it's taxpayers' money. I would like to hear your rationale, like how come he can be so successful also running the state in the same way he was running his own companies?
Well, I mean, I don't think he can run it precisely the same way because of the inherent weight of bureaucracy and regulation. But one of the reasons I'm very comfortable with Trump is I think our system has become very, very muscle-bound with bureaucracy that doesn't work. I mean, you look at our Veterans Administration, it's embarrassing how bad it is. We're very muscle-bound with layers of regulation that make no sense. And I think his instinct, and I'll give you a very simple example. Our system is currently, and the best two books that describe this are actually British. One is called Yes Minister and the other is called Yes Prime Minister, which I recommend to everybody as a case study in how civil servants protect the system from politicians. And we, for example, appointed a very competent, very intelligent West Point graduate who was the CEO of Procter & Gamble in order to fix the Veterans Administration. He was there about 6 weeks before they totally co-opted him. And one of the points I've been making to Trump is, you know, you don't want to hire people to manage these bureaucracies. You want to hire people who are used to turning companies around. You want people who walk in understanding the current system can't possibly survive. And that means you're going to have a very adversarial relationship with the senior civil service. And if you're not prepared to do that, you won't fix anything, because their primary interest is to sort of maintain the status quo. So it'll be interesting to see how much he can get done. I can tell you that Reagan, who had a similar philosophy, was pretty sophisticated in the zones he focused on. I mean, he didn't accomplish the scale that Trump wants to. He didn't, you know, but in the zones he focused on, he was very methodical. about getting the things he wanted. And I suspect part of the difference is that Trump has massively greater energy and a substantially larger ego than Reagan, and that Reagan only had 3 major goals: rebuild American civic culture so we'd be proud to be American, relaunch the American economy, defeat the Soviet Empire. That was it. I mean, everything else was detail. And he had a pretty good track record. Trump will have, I think, an intuitively larger sense of the scale of change we need, because the system is much sicker now than it was in 1980. And it'll be interesting to see how he does it. I mean, so I think there was one last question. Yes, sir.
But on trade issues, I always admire that the U.S. has been the champion of the free trade. But it seems to me that the U.S. is now retreating from free trade to fair trade. And perhaps I'm just a bit concerned that it is retreating into a kind of protectionism. And I don't believe that's in the interest of the U.S., China, as well as the whole world. I guess what we need to do together is to write the rules together with other countries. China is not going to write the rules by itself. I guess the U.S. is not going to write the rules. And we've got the WTO rules, which we all, abide by. So I think maybe we need to work with each other to find the solution to address our own problems. Maybe accusing or finger point doesn't, resolve the problems. And by the way, I guess hardworking people should not be blamed for their hard working. And the Chinese people, they don't go to, the beach every summer to enjoy the sunshine, and we work very hard. So I guess maybe at the end of the comment, I would ask for your comments on that.
Well, look,
Thank you.
I'm all for hardworking people, but I think you would concede that if the Director of National Intelligence reports that we lost $360 billion in intellectual property last year to one country, that's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. I mean, it's nice to know people are hardworking, but if they're hardworking stealing our intellectual property, that doesn't make me feel good. I mean, I don't have quite the level of admiration that I'd like to have. And so I think you've got to, there's a little book called The Bramble Bush, published in 1929, which was the freshman entering lectures at Columbia on being a lawyer. And the whole point of The Bramble Bush was that there's the law as it's written and the law as it's practiced. And sometimes the law as it's practiced isn't quite the same as the law as it's written, and really successful lawyers need to know which game they're involved in, all right? Well, there's free trade as theoretical people talk about it. And then there's free trade as it actually exists. And I think what Trump is saying is that we need and I'll close with a story which actually comes from Beijing. We need a much tougher American approach to protecting our interest within a scheme of, because it's not totally free trade, it's a regulated trade environment, as you said, with the World WTO, which I helped pass. I mean, so I'm not standing here, saying let's withdraw, but I'll tell you the story that opened my eyes. I happened to be in Beijing a few years ago, and I went to the Pearl Market, which is a great tourist site. Any of you who've never been there, it's about an 8-story building. And I happened to have with me 2 people, one of whom had been Cheney's national security advisor, both of whom had graduated from the University of Beijing, both of whom were fluent in Chinese, and both of whom loved shopping in China. And we go in, and we go upstairs, and I have 2 grandchildren. At the time, they're like 6 and 8. And I found 2 pair of terrific silk pajamas. And the guy who really liked to shop the most said to me, whatever number the lady in the shop tells you, offer her 10%. So she wanted, I think, 200 yuan. And I said, well, 20. He said, she will now explain to you that you're going to bankrupt her and put her out of business, which she did. And then she came back at, say, 140. He said, go up a little bit. So we did this for about 10 minutes. But being an American, Americans get very uncomfortable negotiating. Because I wanted to get to a solution. I felt bad. I was sure I was taking advantage of her. So I ended up like at 50 yuan. And the guy said to me with total disgust, she would have sold at 30. Now, but here's the lesson I took from that, which you might think about, and feel free to drop me a note about sometime. The Chinese, and there are many cultures like this, the Chinese really like negotiating, and they're really good at it. I had a friend who opened the first big American battery plant in China, who negotiated for 3 years. He was from Minneapolis. The minister he negotiated, this is the very beginning of the opening up of the system under Deng Xiaoping. 3 years of negotiations, constant translation. They finally sign a contract. They have a celebratory dinner. Sitting across from him is the minister he's been negotiating for 3 years. The guy looks at him and says, "How about them golden gophers?" He says, "What?" He said, "Oh, I was the football boy for the Minnesota Golden Gophers when I went to the University of Minnesota." He spoke totally fluent English, but he had used the spacing of the translations to have a total advantage in the negotiation. Now, my only point is, we appoint some person who's really well-meaning. They go into the meeting thinking they're supposed to get a deal. They're up against a person who thinks they ought to negotiate for a while, and if they don't get a good deal, we ought to negotiate some more, and if that doesn't work, we ought to meet again in 6 weeks. You are never going to have a successful American system if we insist on appointing people who aren't good negotiators, and then we get tired. So I don't disagree with you. I think we're going to have some changes in the regulatory system. They're going to have to be much more effective. They've got to be policed better, because we are still, for all practical purposes, the wealthiest country in the world, which means if you're going to take advantage of somebody, you're going to try to take advantage of us, and that's perfectly human. It's not your fault that we're stupid. And on that cheerful note, I wish you a great afternoon. Thank you.